July 1944. The beaches of Normandy are still littered with the wreckage of the D-Day landings 3 weeks earlier. Allied forces are pushing across France. The war in Europe is far from over. But 730 delegates from 44 countries have gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, not to plan the next battle, but to answer a question that will shape the world for the next 80 years. When the war ends, whose money will the world use? The answer might seem obvious today: the dollar. But in 1944, the dollar was not the world's currency. It had never been the world's currency. That title belonged to the British pound sterling, and before the pound, to currencies most Americans have never heard of. So how did a piece of green paper printed in Washington become the most trusted financial instrument on earth? That is the question this story answers. And it starts not in 1944, but centuries earlier, with a Spanish silver coin. For most of human history, there was no single world currency. Trade was local, and whatever metal coins the local ruler stamped were what you used. But as empires expanded and trade routes stretched across oceans, certain coins became widely accepted simply because they showed up everywhere. The first currency to achieve something close to global dominance was the Spanish silver dollar, also known as the piece of 8. Starting in the late 1500s, Spain was mining staggering quantities of silver from its colonies in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. The mines at Potosi alone, high in the Andes of modern-day Bolivia, produced so much silver that the city briefly became one of the largest in the world. The silver was minted into coins of consistent weight and purity, and those coins flowed into every major trade network on the planet. Spanish silver dollars circulated in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, India, China, and the Americas. They were so widely recognized that Chinese merchants preferred them to their own currency for large transactions. They became the unofficial currency of international trade for nearly 300 years, and their influence was so deep that when American colonists needed a name for their own currency after independence, they chose the word dollar, precisely because the Spanish dollar was the coin everyone already knew and trusted. The dollar sign itself, that S with the 2 vertical lines through it, is believed by many historians to derive from a symbol on the Spanish coin. But Spain's dominance faded as its empire weakened in the 1700s. The mines produced less silver. The Spanish crown spent faster than it earned, financing wars across Europe that drained its treasury. The currency that replaced it was the Dutch guilder. The Netherlands, a tiny country on the North Sea, had built the most sophisticated financial system the world had ever seen. Amsterdam was the global center of banking, insurance, and securities trading. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602, was the first modern stock exchange. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, provided a stable and reliable platform for international payments that merchants across Europe trusted completely. The Dutch East India Company was the world's first publicly traded corporation, with shares that could be bought and sold by anyone. The guilder's reliability and the extraordinary depth and innovation of Amsterdam's financial markets made it the go-to currency for international commerce throughout the 17th and into the early 18th century. Dutch bankers financed kings, wars, and trading expeditions across the globe, and the guilder was the thread that connected all of it. The guilder's reign ended for the same reasons Spain's had. The empire behind it lost its edge. By the early 1800s, the British Empire had surpassed every rival. Britain controlled the world's largest navy, the most extensive trade network, and the most advanced industrial economy on the planet. And the currency of that empire, the pound sterling, was about to become the most dominant reserve currency the world had ever seen. The key to the pound's dominance was the gold standard. In 1821, Britain formally linked the pound to a fixed quantity of gold. 1 pound was worth a specific weight of the precious metal, and the Bank of England, which had been founded all the way back in 1694, guaranteed that anyone holding paper pounds could exchange them for physical gold at that rate. The Bank of England was, at that point, one of the oldest and most trusted financial institutions on earth. Its word was considered as solid as the gold in its vaults. The system provided extraordinary stability that no previous monetary arrangement had achieved. If you were a merchant in Shanghai or a banker in Buenos Aires, you knew exactly what a British pound was worth because it was backed by a vault full of gold in London. The genius of the gold standard was that it made currency values predictable across borders without requiring any international agreement or institution to manage them. Every currency tied to gold was automatically tied to every other currency tied to gold. A British pound, a French franc, and a German mark could all be converted into each other at fixed rates because they were all measured against the same metal. This eliminated the exchange rate risk that had always made international trade expensive and uncertain. Other nations followed Britain's lead. By the 1870s, most major economies had adopted their own versions of the gold standard, tying their currencies to gold and, by extension, to each other. This created the first truly international monetary system. Exchange rates between countries were stable and predictable. Trade flourished. Capital flowed freely across borders. And at the center of it all sat the Bank of England and the British pound. By 1900, the pound accounted for roughly 62% of all known global reserves. International contracts were written in pounds. Commodities were priced in pounds. Loans between nations were denominated in pounds. Insurance policies issued through Lloyd's of London, the world's most important insurance market, were settled in pounds. If you wanted to do business anywhere in the world, you needed pounds, which meant you needed a relationship with a bank in London. The City of London, that ancient square mile of banks and trading houses along the Thames, was the financial capital of the planet, and the pound sterling was the language of global commerce. The system was not democratic. It gave Britain enormous advantages. London banks charged fees on every international transaction. British manufacturers had access to cheap capital that their competitors did not. The Royal Navy protected the trade routes that the pound traveled on. And because every country needed pound reserves, there was always demand for British debt, which meant Britain could borrow money more cheaply than almost anyone else. Being the country behind the world's reserve currency was not just prestigious. It was profitable in ways that touched every corner of the economy. But the pound's dominance rested on a foundation that looked permanent and was not. It depended on Britain remaining the world's leading economic and military power. The moment that changed, the pound's position would change with it. Then came the first war that was truly global, and everything changed. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain immediately suspended the gold standard. The government needed to print money to fund the war effort, and you cannot print unlimited money when every note has to be backed by a fixed amount of gold in a vault. Britain was not alone. Every major European belligerent abandoned gold convertibility within weeks of the war starting. The entire monetary system that had governed international trade for half a century was suspended overnight. The war lasted 4 years, consumed the resources of an entire continent, and cost Britain roughly $35 billion in today's terms. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States to finance the conflict. By the time the armistice was signed in November of 1918, Britain had gone from the world's largest creditor to a debtor nation. It owed enormous sums to the United States, which had entered the war late, supplied both sides with weapons and materials for years before entering, and emerged with its economy not only intact but substantially strengthened. The physical destruction of the war happened in Europe, not in America. American factories hummed at full capacity while European ones were converted to munitions production or destroyed entirely. The United States had been building economic power for decades before the war even started. American industrial output had surpassed Britain's by the 1890s. By 1913, the United States was producing more steel, more coal, and more manufactured goods than Britain, Germany, and France combined. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, gave the country a central bank capable of managing a modern currency and stabilizing the financial system during crises, and the war had turned America into the world's banker. European nations that had borrowed heavily to fight were now paying interest to American lenders. Gold flowed steadily from European vaults to American ones, a transfer of wealth that would continue for the next 3 decades. The shift was not just financial, it was psychological. For over a century, the world had looked to London as the center of global finance. Bankers in New York, Paris, and Berlin had all calibrated their decisions against what the Bank of England did. Now, for the first time, the balance of financial gravity was tilting across the Atlantic. The pound was still the world's reserve currency in name, but the economic foundations underneath it were cracking. American banks were lending more, producing more, and accumulating more gold than their British counterparts. The question was whether the pound could hold its position while the empire behind it was shrinking. In 1925, Britain made a decision that would answer that question definitively. Winston Churchill, then serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 to the pound. Churchill later admitted he was not an expert in monetary policy and had relied heavily on advice from the Bank of England, which wanted to restore London's status as the world's financial center. The problem was that Britain's economy was no longer what it had been before the war. The country had less gold, lower industrial output, and higher debt. The old exchange rate made British exports expensive and uncompetitive on the world market, while making imports artificially cheap. The result was deflation, wage cuts, rising unemployment, and economic stagnation that lasted years and contributed to widespread labor unrest, including the General Strike of 1926. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes wrote a scathing pamphlet titled The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, arguing that the decision was catastrophic and that Churchill had sacrificed British workers on the altar of financial prestige. Keynes was right. The restored gold standard did not save the pound's global position. It hastened its decline. Britain abandoned the gold standard again in 1931, this time for good. The Great Depression had ravaged the global economy. Banks were collapsing across Europe and America. Unemployment in the industrialized world reached levels never seen before. Country after country dropped off gold as they scrambled to devalue their currencies and boost exports. The result was monetary chaos on a scale the world had never experienced. Nations engaged in competitive devaluations, each trying to make their goods cheaper than their neighbors. They imposed tariffs and trade barriers to protect their own industries. International trade collapsed by roughly 65% between 1929 and 1934. The carefully constructed monetary system of the 19th century, the system that had made the pound the world's currency, was in ruins. The lesson was burned into the minds of an entire generation of economists, central bankers, and policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. Without international monetary cooperation, the global economy would tear itself apart. Currencies needed stability. International trade needed predictability, and someone or some institution backed by a credible economy needed to provide both. The question was, who? And in the middle of this wreckage, the United States was accumulating gold at a rate that would reshape the global balance of power. In 1933, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, requiring American citizens to turn in their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at the existing price of $20.67 per ounce. The following year, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which raised the official price of gold to $35 per ounce. This effectively devalued the dollar against gold by nearly 40% overnight, making American exports dramatically cheaper on the world market and attracting foreign gold into U.S. vaults at the higher price. Gold poured into America from Europe, Asia, and South America. The strategy worked. By the late 1930s, the United States held over half of all the monetary gold in the world. European nations, many of which were spending heavily on rearmament as the threat of another war grew more urgent by the month, were selling gold reserves to buy American weapons, machinery, and raw materials. By the time World War II ended in 1945, America held approximately two-thirds of the world's gold reserves, an amount so vast that no other nation could come close to challenging the dollar's credibility. The vault at Fort Knox, which had been built in 1936 specifically to hold the nation's expanding gold reserves, was not just a symbol of American wealth. It was the vault that would underwrite the next global currency. If you're finding this valuable and want to see more deep dives into the hidden stories that shape the world economy, hit that subscribe button. We cover the financial history behind the systems you interact with every single day. Now, back to that hotel in New Hampshire. World War II finished what World War I had started. Britain's economy was shattered, its factories bombed, its colonies demanding independence, and its gold reserves nearly gone. The British Empire, which had underwritten the pound's dominance for over a century, was breaking apart. Meanwhile, the United States had spent the war building the most productive economy in human history. American factories produced more steel, more oil, more manufactured goods, and more food than any nation had ever produced before. The question was no longer whether the dollar would replace the pound. The question was what the new system would look like. Two men had been working on competing answers to that question for years before the conference even began. John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world, represented Britain. Keynes was brilliant, charming, and accustomed to being the smartest person in every room he entered. He had warned in 1919 that the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles would lead to economic catastrophe, and he had been right. His reputation gave him enormous influence, but his country was broke. An influence without economic power has limits. Harry Dexter White, a relatively obscure official in the U.S. Treasury Department, represented the United States. White was the opposite of Keynes in almost every way. Short, Blunt and famously abrasive, he was a Harvard-trained economist who had risen through the Treasury Department on sheer brilliance and the complete trust of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who was in turn a close friend of President Roosevelt. White had been working on his plan for a post-war monetary system since before the United States even entered the war. He had far less public fame than Keynes, but he had something Keynes did not. He had America's gold reserves behind him. Their visions for the post-war monetary order were fundamentally different, and the tension between them would define everything that happened at Bretton Woods. Keynes proposed a radical idea. He wanted to create a brand new international currency called the Bancor. The Bancor would not belong to any single country. It would be managed by an international institution that could issue it as needed to stabilize global trade. Countries that ran large trade surpluses would be penalized just as heavily as countries that ran large deficits, forcing both sides to adjust. Keynes saw this as the only way to prevent the cycle of booms, busts, and competitive devaluations that had wrecked the global economy in the 1930s. White had a very different idea. He proposed a system in which the US dollar would sit at the center of global finance. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. Countries could adjust their exchange rates if they experienced a severe economic imbalance, but only with the approval of a new international institution, the International Monetary Fund. The choice between the two plans was not really a negotiation. It was a recognition of economic reality. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold. American factories were producing half of the world's manufactured goods. No other major economy had emerged from the war with its infrastructure intact. Britain was broke, exhausted, and dependent on American loans to survive. Keynes understood the situation perfectly. He later admitted privately that the Bancor never had a realistic chance. The Americans had the gold, and whoever has the gold makes the rules. The conference voted to adopt White's plan. On July 22, 1944, the delegates signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. The US dollar was officially the anchor of the global monetary system. 35 US dollars equaled 1 troy ounce of gold. The Japanese yen was fixed at 360 to the dollar. The British pound was fixed at $2.80. The French franc, the German mark, the Italian lira, every major currency in the non-communist world was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. The agreement also created two institutions designed to manage the new system. The International Monetary Fund would monitor exchange rates, provide short-term loans to countries experiencing balance of payments difficulties, and serve as a forum for international monetary cooperation. The World Bank would provide long-term capital for reconstruction and development, particularly in war-devastated Europe and the developing world. The system worked spectacularly well, at least for a while. The 1950s and 60s are sometimes called the golden age of capitalism, and the Bretton Woods system was a major reason why. Fixed exchange rates eliminated the currency uncertainty that had paralyzed trade in the 1930s. Businesses could plan long-term investments knowing that exchange rates would remain stable. International trade expanded at rates never seen before. Western Europe and Japan rebuilt their economies from the ground up, powered in part by American investment and the stability of the dollar-based system. But the system contained a fatal contradiction that a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin identified as early as 1960. The problem, which became known as the Triffin Dilemma, was simple. For the world to have enough dollars to use as a reserve currency, the United States had to run persistent trade deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it took in. But the more dollars the U.S. sent abroad, the less credible its promise to redeem those dollars for gold became. Eventually, there would be more dollars in foreign hands than there was gold in American vaults to back them. And that is exactly what happened. Through the 1960s, the costs of the Vietnam War, President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society social programs, and the space race combined to push American government spending far beyond its revenue. The U.S. printed dollars to cover the gap. Those dollars flowed overseas. Foreign central banks, particularly in France and West Germany, began quietly converting their dollars into gold, draining American reserves. French President Charles de Gaulle became the most vocal critic of the arrangement. He accused the United States of exploiting what his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, memorably called the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's money. De Gaulle sent French naval vessels to New York to physically collect gold from the Federal Reserve Bank's vault and ship it back to Paris. Other nations followed suit, more discreetly. By 1971, the situation was unsustainable. Foreign governments held far more dollars than the United States had gold to redeem them. On August 13th of that year, President Richard Nixon secretly gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David for an emergency weekend meeting. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a small circle of officials spent 2 days designing a new economic policy behind closed doors. No foreign governments were consulted. No allies were warned. On the evening of August 15th, Nixon went on national television and announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He also imposed a 90-day freeze on wages and prices and a 10% surcharge on imports. The gold window was closed. The temporary measure was never reversed. The Bretton Woods System, the monetary architecture that had governed global finance for 27 years, was effectively finished overnight. In Italy the next morning, bank officials instructed currency exchange offices across the country to stop all operations. American tourists found themselves unable to exchange their dollars. The world had changed while they slept. What replaced it was something nobody at Bretton Woods had planned or prepared for. Currencies began to float freely against each other, their values rising and falling daily based on market forces rather than government agreement. The dollar remained the world's primary reserve currency, but it was no longer backed by gold or by any physical commodity at all. It was backed by something far more abstract and far more fragile. Trust in the U.S. economy, the depth and liquidity of American financial markets, and the sheer institutional momentum of a system that had been built around the dollar for nearly 3 decades. That trust was reinforced in the mid-1970s when the United States struck a series of deals with Saudi Arabia and other major oil-producing nations in the Middle East. In exchange for American military protection and arms sales, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars and to invest its surplus oil revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. Other OPEC nations followed. This petrodollar system meant that every country in the world that needed to buy oil, which was every industrialized country on Earth, needed dollars to do it. A Japanese automaker buying crude from Kuwait needed dollars. A German chemical plant importing oil from Saudi Arabia needed dollars. A Brazilian airline fueling its planes needed dollars. Global demand for the currency remained enormous, even without any gold backing, because you could not participate in the most important commodity market in the world without it. The French phrase exorbitant privilege has echoed through monetary debates ever since. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the United States can borrow money at lower interest rates than any other country. It can run larger trade deficits without the immediate consequences that would punish other nations. It can impose financial sanctions that cut entire countries off from the global banking system because that system runs on dollars. Every barrel of oil, every international bank transfer, every foreign government's reserve portfolio connects back to the currency that Harry Dexter White placed at the center of the world and a New Hampshire hotel in 1944. The story of how the dollar became the world's currency is not a story about one conference or one agreement. It is a story about the slow, grinding transfer of power from one empire to another, played out over 2 world wars, a global depression, and a mountain of gold bars. The Spanish Peace of 8 ruled because Spain had the silver. The Dutch guilder ruled because Amsterdam had the banks. The British pound ruled because London had the empire. And the dollar rules because, in 1944, the United States had the gold, the factories, and the leverage to write the rules of the game. Every empire that has held this position has held it for a while, but eventually lost it. The Spanish silver dollar lasted about 3 centuries. The Dutch guilder lasted about 2. The British pound lasted roughly 130 years. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency for 80 years and counting. Whether that number keeps growing depends on the same factors that determined every transition before it: economic strength, institutional trust, and whether the country behind the currency can maintain both long enough to keep the world believing that its money is worth something. That green piece of paper in your wallet is accepted at every airport, hotel, and market on Earth, not because of what it is, but because of a deal made at a hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire while the world was still at war. Every other currency in the world is measured against it, and that arrangement, which seems like it has existed forever, has only been in place for 80 years. Before that, the world used pounds. Before pounds, guilders. Before guilders, Spanish silver coins stamped with the number 8. The only constant in the history of money is that no currency stays on top forever.